Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous honor and privilege to be invited here to the Nobel Institute to address you this afternoon. I can only apologize for the brevity of my visit. This is an uncommonly busy time for me. That's probably somebody phoning to ask me to come to another European city. As I've just published my latest book in the United States, and it was only with difficulty that I was able to fight off the Penguin Books publicity department, who reacted with dismay when I told them that I was heading to Oslo, where they wrongly assumed relatively few copies of the book would sell. I hope you will prove them wrong. I want to speak to you this afternoon about degeneration. But before I define what I mean by that, I want to take you back in time, as we historians like to do. I want to take you back nearly a quarter of a century, to the summer of 1989. Think back. Where were you? One member of our audience right at the back wasn't even born, but the rest of us will have memories of that time. I was in Berlin, and I was in the final phase of researching a doctoral dissertation on the hyperinflation that racked Germany after World War I, an event, it must be said, that continues to play a part in European politics to this day. I was very struck that summer by a change. And the change was that suddenly I was no longer alone in the S-Bahn from Friedrichstraße to Zoologische Garten. In those days, only a very few people could make that journey. To be precise, it was only British, American, and French citizens who could travel from Friedrichstraße in Ost-Berlin to Zoologische Garten in West by S-Bahn. And normally, one traveled alone. In the summer of 1989, that changed, and one found oneself accompanied by people from other East European countries. Poles, Hungarians. What was happening, we now realize, was the degeneration of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. That degeneration so impressed me that I wrote an article for one of the British newspapers, which I gave the provisional headline, "The Berlin Wall is Crumbling." Had that article been published, I could claim to be one of the tiny number of people who foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it was not, because, and I quote a sub-editor on that newspaper, "The editor thinks, Neil, you've been listening to one too many Ronald Reagan speeches." By the way, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't it odd that the other day President Obama traveled to Berlin and stood at the Brandenburg Gate in his shirt sleeves, alluding to President Kennedy's much shorter speech, "Ich bin ein Berliner," but making no reference whatsoever to Ronald Reagan's speech, a speech which I think one can say did indeed change the course of history, Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down. Well, that wall was torn down. And as a result, another academic, more eminent than me, became the man who foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall, namely Francis Fukuyama. That summer, Fukuyama had published his essay, The End of History. And as the Berlin Wall crumbled, Fukuyama stood vindicated. 24 years on, it's funny to go back to that essay and see what he wrote. I quote, "An unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism, the triumph of the West." This was Fukuyama's definition of the end of history as he saw it in the summer of 1989. The end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. 24 years on, it doesn't quite look, to me, like the triumph of the West, much less the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. If the International Monetary Fund is to be believed, within 3 years, the gross domestic product of China, measured on a purchasing power parity adjusted basis, will exceed that of the United States. For the first time since 1882, it will be possible for another country to claim that its economy is larger than that of the United States of America. Sam Huntington was another writer of the post-Cold War era to enjoy great and in many ways justified influence. Huntington's definition of the West was a rather different one from Fukuyama's, but if one takes that definition and looks at it demographically, we are hardly living through the triumph of the West. In 1950, Huntington's West, using his geographical definition, accounted for 20%, just over a fifth of the world's population. The United Nations projects a population for future decades. According to its medium-range projection, that share by 2050 will have declined to just above 10%. Demographically, the West is certainly not triumphing.